Mr Speaker, the Labor Party opposes this bill with every bone in our body. It says the bill claims that it will increase transparency and accountability of local government. In fact, it will do the opposite. Sir. It will, like all of the bills that this minister has brought to the House for local government in the last 2 years, it will undermine our public institutions and undermine our democratic process. Sir, we've talked about water privatisation a lot, and no matter how much screeching we hear from the government backbenchers about whether or not this is in fact water privatisation, New Zealanders will not be fooled by the blatant lack of transparency that this minister has displayed in bringing this bill to the House. This bill will allow long-term contracts up to 35 years to control, for private sector operations, to control our water supply. This bill, under clause 32(4)(d), explicitly allows the sale of pre-existing water infrastructure as part of these long-term contracts. And, sir, it is not, as the Associate Minister tried to argue this morning, simply something that's there to add some more options for cash-strapped small rural councils. This bill will allow the billion-dollar water monopoly set up under Rodney Hyde Super City in Auckland to be contracted out to United Water for periods of up to 35 years, including the private ownership of pre-existing water infrastructure. And, sir, the ratepayers and the citizens of Auckland could be given no say under this bill, because at the same time as allowing water infrastructure to be sold to private sector interests, it also does away with the provisions in our law, in our local government law, that would guarantee citizens the right to be consulted before their assets and their services are either corporatised or contracted out. And a combination of those two things is to imperil our public ownership of ratepayer-owned assets and resources. And we're talking about water specifically, but the same principle applies to all sorts of other strategic assets. Does anybody, seriously, other than the deluded members sitting opposite, does anybody believe seriously that the privatisation of our water supply won't result in the inevitable price hikes that people have seen that have accompanied other botched privatisation initiatives that we've seen over the last few years? We know that if you hand over a natural monopoly like water supply to the private sector, it will almost inevitably end up in foreign hands. The guaranteed profits that will flow from private ownership of a natural monopoly will flow overseas. That's money going out of the pockets of New Zealand ratepayers and householders straight into the pockets of overseas-owned companies. Does anybody not believe that if you hand over resources of this scale, a billion-dollar water monopoly in Auckland, if you hand it over to the private sector, that it won't result in huge corporate salaries further gouging the pockets of the ratepayer? This is not a good idea, and I remind members opposite that the most recent independent opinion polls on this issue have showed that 80% of New Zealanders are opposed to any privatisation of our water system. And it is a matter of choice, as the Minister pointed out. It is a matter of choice, and New Zealanders, when they go to the polls next year, will be very mindful of what this Minister did to Auckland local government. They'll be very mindful of what the Honourable Nick Smith did to democracy in Canterbury, and they'll be very mindful of this bill opening up their municipal water supply to privatisation, and they will make a choice at the polls. Because what this government's doing is that it's gutting our local government public institutions and the democratic process. And those two things go hand in hand. They're taking the voice away from ordinary people, and they're opening the door to private control and ownership of assets and resources that New Zealanders have built up over generations through their rates. And certain New Zealanders will not forget that. There are other obnoxious aspects to this bill that we have opposed steadfastly, sir, through this whole process. And one of them is the idea of core services, that this minister, whose party currently commands about 2% in the polls, is able to impose, not 2%, he's able to impose an ideological and arbitrary list of core services that he defines as core services. Nobody else does. Hardly a soul turned up at the Select Committee to say that this was a good idea. 98% of the submitters came along and said, this is a lousy idea, either put my issues, my services in the list, or else don't have it at all. And yet the implications of what that could mean is that a rural community, for example, who wants to provide free premises for a GP service so they can get a doctor in their rural community, they could be vulnerable to claims either through the annual planning process or through the normal political debate that this is not a core service, or in fact a legal challenge, that this is not a core service and therefore they should not be engaging in it. What this does is it tilts the playing field away from the democratic process that allows citizens to decide in conjunction with their elected representatives what constitutes a core service. This bill, sir, also makes a number of cuts to obligations currently on councils to consult their citizens. It allows councils to contract out public services to the private sector. It allows them to corporatise their assets and operations by shifting them into council-owned companies without consulting their citizens. And that, sir, is a breach of people's fundamental democratic rights. It constrains the whole process of setting community outcomes, the high-level goals that go into our council's long-term plans. Under this bill, under Rodney Hyde's bill, a council could make up the community outcomes out of thin air, out of the last thing that someone said to them on the street or in the supermarket. They're not required to consult the community in setting those outcomes. It also restricts it unduly by requiring that community outcomes can only be things that the council itself can deliver on. So many of the most pressing issues for local communities, crime, safety, alcohol, pokies, any number of these issues, because the councils don't control or don't have access to all the levers to solve those problems, they can't be made a community outcome. And that, sir, is just yet another example of this government, this minister, taking democratic rights away from New Zealanders. They've gutted the consultation process for decision making about many of the important things that will go into the annual plan. So currently there's a four-stage process that we've admitted was overdue for streamlining and could easily have been reduced down. But actually what this government's done is thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and now there is no principle-based mechanism that requires consultation on these important decisions. And I predict, sir, that many of the government's natural supporters and voters in leafy suburbs up and down this country who are the most demanding of their local authorities, they will blame the National Party for taking away their democratic rights. Sir, we've seen 3 bits of legislation that imposed an unpopular Rodney Hyde-inspired super city on our country's biggest city. Most of that legislation was pushed through this House under urgency. We saw the sacking of Environment Canterbury by the Honourable Nick Smith, again done under urgency. And now this is the third leg of the treble, sir, gutting our local government legislation, handing over our resources to privatisation and corporatisation. This is the legacy that this Minister of Local Government, who set out with such grand aspirations to be the Minister of Ratepayers, this is what he's done. He has weakened and undermined our public institutions, taken away the voice of New Zealanders over things that are justifiably their right to have a say on and to be consulted on. He comes to this House trumpeting transparency and accountability, But everything about the way he has implemented this legislation, everything about the way he has implemented his policies speaks of the opposite, sir. It is not transparency and accountability, it is the opposite, and the public of New Zealand will hold him and this government accountable for it.
Chris Okenvold.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.